Hello, my friends. What we are witnessing today in Europe is not theft in the conventional sense. Theft implies secrecy. What the European Union is attempting to do with Russian assets is not theft carried out in the shadows. It is an act committed openly, brazenly, and with full awareness of its consequences. The more accurate term is burglary. And the reason this burglary has not yet been fully executed is simple. The consequences for those attempting it would be severe and potentially catastrophic. That reality framed much of what unfolded during President Vladimir Putin's marathon end-of-year question and answer session, a political exercise that alone exposes the stark contrast between Russia and what is often referred to as the collective West. For more than 4 hours, Putin fielded questions not only from domestic journalists and ordinary citizens, but also from hostile international outlets, BBC, French media, and others openly critical of Russia. He answered them directly, calmly, and without filters. This is something fundamentally absent in Western political culture today. One would never see Russian journalists permitted to interrogate figures such as Ursula von der Leyen or Emmanuel Macron with comparable openness. The irony, of course, is that such openness is endlessly preached by Western governments, yet conspicuously absent in practice. A significant portion of Putin's session focused on domestic matters, housing, mortgages, education, employment, family life, wages. These are not the questions of a society consumed by total war. They are the concerns of a functioning state with long-term priorities. The West continues to insist that Russia has transformed itself into a war economy. The evidence, however, contradicts this narrative. A true war economy does not spend hours discussing housing policy and family planning. The picture that emerged was not one of desperation, but of stability. Ukraine was discussed extensively, but not obsessively. Roughly one-third of the session addressed the conflict, negotiations, sanctions, and battlefield realities. Putin provided a level of operational clarity that Western leaders carefully avoid. He spoke plainly about advances along the line of contact, emphasizing that Russian forces are advancing across the entire front. He stated that the Krasny-Liman area would be taken in the near future, that more than half of Konstantinovka is already under Russian control, and that Guliai-Pol and Vuhledar are likewise increasingly dominated by Russian forces. Most notably, he emphasized that once Sloviansk and Kramatorsk fall, Ukraine's last major fortified positions in Donbass, the strategic military architecture of Ukrainian resistance collapses. These are not symbolic cities. They are the backbone of Ukraine's defensive depth. Beyond them, there are no comparable fortifications. The implication is clear. The decisive phase of the Donbass campaign is approaching its conclusion. Putin also addressed Kupiansk, noting that approximately 3,500 Ukrainian troops are encircled there, with escape routes effectively eliminated. This is not propaganda. It is a military reality consistent with independent battlefield reporting. Against this backdrop, the Ukrainian president's highly publicized social media performances appear increasingly hollow. Putin rightly pointed out the absurdity of staging video appearances outside supposedly secured cities. If control is genuine, why not enter the city itself? The contradiction is obvious. The contrast between Putin's 4-hour session and Ukraine's leadership could not be more striking. In Brussels, Ukraine's president delivered a brief set of statements, primarily focused on one objective: extracting money. The demand was staggering, approximately $225 billion. What was obtained was far less, roughly 90 euros billion, structured not as grants but as loans, and not even unanimously supported across the EU. This outcome was widely portrayed by EU officials as a success. In reality, it was a failure. The European Union could not agree on seizing Russian frozen assets, nor could it unify around a comprehensive financing mechanism. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic refused participation, leaving a small core, primarily Germany and France, on the hook for most of the burden. Even this 90 euros billion figure is deceptive. Once corruption, administrative siphoning, and military-industrial allocations are accounted for, the usable funds available to keep the Ukrainian state functioning shrink dramatically. At best, This money buys time, 6 months to a year. It does not change the strategic trajectory of the conflict. More revealing were the statements made in Brussels regarding NATO. Ukraine's president openly acknowledged that he had been told years earlier that Ukraine would not be admitted to NATO. If true, this admission is devastating. It exposes the past 3 years of rhetoric about irreversible paths as deliberate deception. NATO leaders repeated these promises endlessly, fully aware that they were never going to be fulfilled. Equally disturbing were remarks suggesting that political leaders come and go. Some live, some die. A thinly veiled comment aimed at future U.S. leadership. This kind of rhetoric underscores the moral bankruptcy at the heart of the current Ukrainian leadership. Lives are expendable, time is expendable, truth is expendable. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban cut through the deception with clarity. He openly stated that Europe narrowly avoided issuing what would effectively have been a declaration of war against Russia by attempting to confiscate Russian assets. He emphasized that if Ukraine cannot repay these so-called loans, and it cannot, European taxpayers will bear the burden. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic refused to place that burden on their citizens. Orban was correct. These are not loans. Zero-interest financing with no realistic expectation of repayment is simply a transfer of wealth. Calling it a loan is a legal fiction designed to obscure accountability. At the same time, the EU approved measures to accelerate military logistics, railways, roads, infrastructure, explicitly to facilitate the rapid movement of weapons and hardware toward Russia's borders. This is not de-escalation. It is preparation. Western officials continue to speak recklessly about destructive responses should Russia act in ways the West deems unacceptable, even while quietly admitting that NATO membership for Ukraine lacks consensus. The contradiction is glaring. They threaten confrontation while admitting internal division. The broader European political landscape reflects growing instability. Trade agreements collapsed under pressure from farmers who understand that globalist policies are destroying their livelihoods. Protests erupted across Brussels, highlighting a widening gap between political elites and citizens. This matters because it signals declining public tolerance for endless war financing. Against this backdrop, Western media narratives become increasingly detached from reality. Claims that Russian commercial shipping constitutes a spy fleet border on parody. The suggestion that Russia, one of the world's most sophisticated spacefaring nations, relies on oil tankers for intelligence collection is not serious analysis. A far more plausible explanation is that security personnel are present to deter sabotage and piracy, particularly given growing Western hostility toward Russian maritime trade. The pattern is consistent. When facts are inconvenient, they are replaced with theatrical narratives. Meanwhile, Russia continues to operate with strategic patience, clarity of objectives, and domestic cohesion. The war in Ukraine is not heading toward a Western victory. Financial exhaustion, political fractures, and battlefield realities make that impossible. The question is no longer whether Ukraine can win, but how much longer Europe will continue paying for an illusion it no longer truly believes in. Russia, by contrast, is playing a long game militarily, economically, and diplomatically. And it is winning that game not through slogans, but through reality. The truth is, the West keeps confusing noise for power. It confuses press conferences for strategy, headlines for logistics, slogans for manufacturing capacity, and unity for obedience. But wars are not won in Brussels at Dre&M. Over spreadsheets and stage-managed statements, wars are won by who can sustain pressure, who can replace losses, who can keep industry humming, who can maintain social cohesion, and who can endure the passage of time without collapsing into panic. And that is why all the talk about taking Russian assets matters so much, because it is the clearest admission yet that Europe has hit the wall. When you can't win on the battlefield, you look for shortcuts. When you can't defeat an opponent, you try to steal his wallet. When you can't change the facts, you try to change the rules. But the world does not reset itself because a committee in Brussels votes to pretend it can. The international system has memory. Capital has memory. States have memory. And the moment Europe normalizes open burglary, open confiscation under the banner of values, it broadcasts to every nation outside the Western bubble that their money, their reserves, their assets, their sovereignty can be targeted next. So this isn't only about Russia. This is about the future of trust. And Europe is burning it down one desperate decision at a time. That is why the deal they are selling as victory is, in reality, an admission of defeat. 90 billion euros is not a rescue plan. It's a postponement. It's a sedative. It is a political injection meant to keep the patient upright long enough for cameras to capture the illusion of movement. But the body underneath is failing. Once you subtract the corruption, the kickbacks, the procurement schemes, and the military-industrial carve-outs, what remains is not a war-winning pipeline, it is a temporary drip feed. And drip feeds do not reverse strategic collapse. They merely delay the moment when everyone can no longer deny what they already know. The battlefield does not care about rhetoric. It does not care about irreversible paths to NATO. It does not care about summit communiques written by exhausted aides. It cares about the line of contact, who holds it, who advances, who is surrounded, who is broken, who runs out of men, who runs out of shells, who runs out of will. And what Putin did during that marathon session, calmly, methodically, without hysteria, was remind the world that Russia is not flailing. Russia is not improvising. Russia is not begging. Russia is not bargaining from weakness. Russia is executing a process. Attrition of Ukraine's forces, dismantling of fortified belts, squeezing supply corridors, and grinding down the illusion that time favors Kiev. Time is the one resource the West cannot print. Europe's leaders want to pretend they can work around dissenting countries, work around elections, work around public fatigue, work around economic reality, but they cannot work around arithmetic. They cannot work around demographics. They cannot work around industrial limits. And they cannot work around the fact that Ukraine's entire war effort has become a financial hostage to foreign parliaments that are already fracturing. Look at what happened in Brussels. Even with maximum political pressure, even with maximum moral blackmail, even with the usual media chorus screaming about solidarity, they still couldn't unify. They still couldn't finalize the asset seizure. They still couldn't get everyone on the same hook. That should terrify them, because it proves that the facade is cracking from within. And once that facade breaks, the war stops being a project and becomes what it always was, a costly losing bet placed by elites who will never personally pay the bill. Russia, meanwhile, doesn't need magical narratives about spy fleets and shadow plots to explain reality. Russia only needs to keep doing what it has been doing, advancing, consolidating, and forcing the West to confront the results of its own decisions. Every month that passes, the West's choices narrow. Every month that passes, the price goes up. Every month that passes, the space for face-saving disappears. And that is why the endgame is coming into view. Not because Russia is lucky, not because Russia is helped, not because Russia is favored, but because Russia built the only thing that matters in prolonged conflict, a coherent strategy married to sustainable capability. While Europe plays with legal tricks and loans it knows will never be repaid, Russia plays with the fundamentals: terrain, manpower, production, momentum, and time. So the real question now is not whether the West can stand with Ukraine in the abstract. The real question is, how long can Europe keep pretending a loan is not a gift, pretending a delay is not a retreat, pretending a communique is not a confession, and pretending that escalation will not eventually turn back on them? Because one day, sooner than they want to admit, they will wake up and realize that the war did not end with a grand Western victory speech. It ended with a quiet recognition that Russia achieved its objectives while Europe exhausted itself chasing illusions. And at that moment, the same people who sold this war as a moral crusade will begin rewriting their own history, claiming they always knew, claiming they always warned, claiming they always sought peace, but the record will remain. The record will show who lied about NATO, who prolonged the bloodshed to avoid admitting failure, who gambled entire economies for a project that could not win, who tried to normalize burglary as policy, and who, in the end, discovered that reality is undefeated because reality does not negotiate with propaganda. That is where this is headed. And when it arrives, it will not be dramatic. It will be cold, administrative, and humiliating. Exactly the kind of ending you get when leaders choose vanity over truth, optics over strategy, and slogans over strength. And the European Union has just handed Ukraine what can only be described as a consolation prize, a 90 billion loan. This comes after their failed attempt to pressure Belgium into surrendering the bulk of the hundreds of billions of euros in frozen Russian assets held on Belgian territory, assets the EU hoped to leverage to bankroll yet another massive loan to Kiev. The plan collapsed because Belgium understood the legal and systemic consequences of outright theft. The deeper question, however, is not whether Brussels can scrape together another financial instrument, but whether any of this meaningfully alters the reality of the war. Based on everything unfolding on the battlefield and confirmed directly by President Vladimir Putin during his 4.5-hour end-of-year Q&A, it does not. Russia has never rejected peace. What Russia has rejected is fraud masquerading as diplomacy. The United States and its European proxies are not offering peace. They are offering pauses designed to buy time, rearm Ukraine, and reset a losing war. Putin made that clear, while also confirming that Russia will respond decisively to the recent drone attack against a Russian oil tanker off the Libyan coast. That attack, publicly attributed by anonymous Ukrainian officials, was not escalation in any meaningful military sense. It was piracy, terrorism on the high seas, conducted with the tacit blessing of London and Berlin. These governments fancy themselves strategic thinkers, yet they are neither militarily competent nor intellectually serious. When a losing side runs out of options, it turns to terrorism. That is exactly what we are witnessing. The so-called shadow fleet is a fabricated term invented by Western insurance cartels and maritime interests furious that Russia no longer relies on them. Russia insures its own vessels. Russia protects its own shipping. And now Russian tankers will sail openly under the Russian flag, escorted and defended. Attacking a Panamanian or Liberian flag vessel is one thing. Attacking a Russian flagged ship is something entirely different, and NATO understands the consequences. Russia has already taken countermeasures. Armed security teams are now deployed aboard vessels. Naval escorts are being coordinated. And if Western intelligence services, MI6, CIA, or their proxies, continue cultivating terrorist cells near maritime choke points, those networks will be dismantled. Russia has people assigned to that task. This war is no longer Ukraine versus Russia. Ukraine, as a functioning military entity, is already finished. What remains is Russia versus NATO, and NATO is losing. European leaders like Merz, Starmer, and Macron are not brave strategists. They are desperate politicians, clinging to power as their legitimacy erodes. They posture because they cannot fight. NATO is a paper tiger. It has no escalation dominance. Russia does. If NATO attempts maritime interdictions against Russian shipping, Russian naval forces will respond in kind. It takes two to tango. Escalation is possible, but it will not favor the West. Russia has prepared for this scenario for years. The Western political class fundamentally misunderstands modern warfare. They are products of Oxford seminars, Ivy League whiteboards, and think tank echo chambers. They excel at narrative control and institutional blackmail, not strategy. The people capable of telling them the truth are excluded from power. As a result, Western elites are completely detached from reality. The combined West has already lost the arms race decisively. This is not marginal. This is not debatable. Outside of America's still large satellite constellation, NATO's military inventory is obsolete. Its force structure reflects 1,990 seconds assumptions. Russia has moved on. Battlefield systems, strategic weapons, ISR integration, hypersonics, air defense. Russia is not ahead by years, but by generations. NATO cannot close this gap. The United States cannot even maintain its own force levels. Congress recently legislated a floor of roughly 1,100 combat aircraft, approximately what Russia already deploys in the Special Military Operation Theater alone. America cannot build modern main battle tanks at scale. It cannot produce frigates efficiently. Its industrial base is hollowed out. Meanwhile, Russia fields S-500 systems with anti-satellite capabilities already in frontline service. Russia possesses one of the world's most capable ISR constellations, operating in real-time 24/7. NATO cannot assemble, deploy, or conceal mass formations without being detected and destroyed. Western leaders do not understand this because they have never studied real war. They understand PowerPoint. As for the United States' political leadership, Donald Trump is not a strategist. He is a New York real estate operator who values gold, branding, and self-promotion. He has no cultural depth, no historical grounding, and no understanding of statecraft. He reads no books. His intuition is that of a deal maker, not a statesman. Russia has offered the United States an off-ramp multiple times. Trump does not grasp it. He believes America can reposition itself as a neutral mediator after being the principal architect of this proxy war. Russia will not allow that. The United States is a co-belligerent. It instigated this conflict alongside Europe. It will bear responsibility for the outcome. Ukraine's fate is sealed. What remains of it will be an agrarian remnant, stripped of industrial capacity, technological base, and demographic viability. Russia has already severed Odessa from Romania by destroying rail and bridge infrastructure, the main NATO supply corridor. Putin openly stated weeks ago that cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea was inevitable. That process is now underway. Europe is finished in its current form, militarily, economically, industrially, scientifically. NATO is a dead organization walking. Western policymakers believe they can buy time, steal Russian money, inject loans, conscript younger Ukrainians, delay the inevitable. They are wrong. Every month they delay, Russia advances. Ukrainian defensive lines collapse. Demographic collapse accelerates. Ukraine has suffered a catastrophic loss. Approximately 2 million killed or missing in action. Millions more wounded or psychologically destroyed. Social life no longer exists. The proposal to draft 8-year-olds is not strategy. It is slaughter. Russia did not propose fighting to the last Ukrainian. NATO did. Russia accepted their offer after Putin's latest statements and the Defense Ministry Collegium. It is clear the phase of negotiations is over. The objectives of the special military operation will be achieved regardless of Western opinion. This is humiliating for the West, but it is reality. The combined Western elite lacks competence, foresight, and courage. They lost the arms race. They lost strategic initiative. And now they are losing the war. That is the situation as it stands. You still hear people, especially in Washington and European capitals, repeating the same tired mantra. We just need more pressure on Russia, more weapons, more sanctions, and then somehow the trajectory of the war will change. What struck me most in recent months, however, is not the persistence of these arguments, but the way the conviction behind them is fading. The rhetoric remains, but the passion has drained away. People still say it, but you can tell they no longer truly believe it. They understand, at least subconsciously, that the trajectory cannot be reversed. And yet, despite this growing realism, they are not ready for peace on any terms. They would rather keep fighting. That contradiction sits at the heart of the Western and Ukrainian position today. It is driven by a deeply embedded assessment of Russia as a permanent threat, an almost theological belief that even if a peace deal were signed tomorrow, Russia would inevitably return later to take more. In that mindset, there is no real choice between war and lasting peace. There is only war now or war later. And so they conclude, we might as well fight now. What is astonishing is how rarely this logic is pushed to its obvious conclusion. If you choose to fight now to avoid fighting later, you may very well lose this war outright. People acknowledge that risk in theory, but they behave as though things will somehow work out anyway. That belief is rooted in experience. Time and again, Ukraine has been pushed to the brink, almost out of air defense, almost out of money, and each time something arrives at the last minute. More missiles, more funding, another creative financial mechanism. Even now, the European Union has devised yet another way to keep Ukraine afloat, not by seizing Russian assets outright, but through loans backed by the EU budget. When I asked directly what the alternative plan was if reparations or asset seizures failed, there was no plan B. The assumption was simply that something would work out. And historically, it often has. That history has reinforced a dangerous complacency, but time is not neutral, it is not infinite, and it is certainly not on Ukraine's side. Privately, many Ukrainian officials admit something else. The deal on the table today is not politically acceptable. But they also admit the deal will not get better. The same deal will still be there in a year after more territory is lost, after more people are dead. Still, it is politically easier to keep fighting now, lose more later, and accept the same deal down the road than it is to accept it today. That is not strategy. That is political paralysis. This brings us to the core constraint that is often ignored in Western discussions, the domestic political reality inside Ukraine. Zelensky is not a free actor. There are hard limits to what he can accept and implement. Any deal must be sold to the Ukrainian public and ratified by the Rada. Territorial concessions are, by overwhelming polling data, a non-starter. Roughly 3/4 of the population reject the idea outright. Even if Zelensky privately agreed to cede territory, he could not deliver it. The Rada would not ratify it. The military might not withdraw. The state itself might fracture under the strain. This is not moral hazard or blind faith in mythical U.S. security guarantees. Ukrainian leaders do not actually believe Washington will ride to the rescue forever. The problem is that the political maneuvering space is so narrow that even when everyone knows the war must end, there is no viable path to accept that reality without risking internal collapse. That reality also shapes Zelensky's public rhetoric. When he speaks about pressuring the United States to pressure Russia, this is not because he believes Washington has decisive leverage. It is because he must perform resolve for a domestic audience. The idea that the United States, especially under Donald Trump, can force Russia to stop is largely fantasy. The U.S. has limited leverage, and Trump is even less inclined to use what little leverage exists. More weapons will not change the outcome. Production limits are real. Europe is effectively exhausted. Escalatory options like long-range missiles introduce enormous risks without altering fundamentals. Sanctions impose costs, but they have failed repeatedly to change Russia's calculus. At this point, additional sanctions may harm the U.S. economy as much as Russia's, particularly when they intersect with China. Where leverage does exist is in areas Russia has consistently identified as core interests: NATO expansion, normalization of relations, arms control, and economic engagement. These are the levers that matter, but they require acknowledging Russia's power, not pretending it can be coerced into submission. Zelensky's speeches about forcing Russia to accept rules and punishing it to uphold a so-called rules-based order reveal how detached Western rhetoric has become from reality. The rules-based order is a comforting myth. Power matters. Military power matters. And pretending otherwise only prolongs the war. A lasting peace will not be just. It will be painful for Ukraine. It will involve accepting losses. The realistic goal is not punishing Russia or restoring some imagined global legal order, but securing what remains of Ukraine in a way that is defensible and stable over the long term. That requires acknowledging Russia's red lines, particularly NATO. The question of elections only complicates this further. Ukraine cannot legally hold elections under martial law. Changing that involves immense legal and logistical challenges. Even if elections were held, the likely alternatives to Zelensky are more hawkish, not less. From Russia's perspective, removing Zelensky does not guarantee an easier negotiation. It may simply produce a more hardline nationalist leadership. There is also a brutal truth rarely stated openly. Whoever signs the peace deal will likely end their political career. The deal will be unpopular, it will be seen as defeat, and that reality incentivizes delay, not resolution. Forcing Ukraine into a bad deal may seem expedient, but it risks creating a permanently unstable, impoverished, hyper-nationalist state. That outcome is bad for Russia, bad for Europe, and bad for the United States. A peace that is seen as temporary will drive more Ukrainians to leave, deter investment, and sow the seeds for future conflict. This is why the idea of coercing an outcome must be approached with caution. Speed is not the only variable that matters. Durability matters. Legitimacy matters. And pretending that Ukraine can simply be pushed into surrender without consequences is dangerously naive. We are moving toward an endgame. Not tomorrow, not this Christmas, but the war is approaching its structural limits. When it ends, it will not confirm Western fantasies. It will confirm what power realities have dictated from the start. The only real question left is how much unnecessary destruction will occur before that truth is finally accepted.